Hi, my name is David Hubel, and this is gonna be a response to the video that I just watched from Council Member Palacios. I applaud you for making the video. You explained yourself very well. Obviously, your position is based on a lot of factors, things that you've thought about and have based your decision around. And I'm only recording a video because you did, and I think it's a better way of communication sometimes in the written word, because there's emotions conveyed in videos that might not come through when you write them. So there's a couple of things that you said that are hard for me to see a young BIPOC woman use as your reasons. First, let me start with the reasons why that is very important, because you're absolutely right that the medical industry and the government have not been just to the BIPOC community basically forever. And if this were an experiment that were only going to be conducted on people of a particular demographic or any other distinguishing characteristic, then there might be something to that argument. But the situation is a lot bigger than that. The situation involves vaccines that have been administered to over 3 billion people around the world. If you counted once every second and tried to count 3 billion, it would take you 93 years, counting 24 hours a day, 360 days a year for 93 days. It's a lot of people. Or 93 years, excuse me. It's a lot of people. They're across the world, and they've been receiving injections for many months now, even years. These vaccines are some of the safest that have ever been created. Now, maybe you never received any vaccines when you were young, and maybe that's why you're concerned about the vaccine. But if you have received vaccines, think about when those were produced. We didn't even understand the human genome. We didn't even understand what a genome was. Our medical technology is so advanced these days that this technology of mRNA vaccinations, it was so refined that when a Chinese researcher took it upon himself to release the genome for the virus, the first mRNA vaccine was created within 14 hours. It was a key, a blank key, ready to be cut and create a vaccine that has saved, at this point, literally millions of lives. From the time June to around the 1st of September in the United States of America, about 100,000 people died from the virus. That's June of this year. 2,500 of them were vaccinated. If everybody, let's just say everybody, hypothetically everybody had been vaccinated, 100,000 would have been reduced to 6,000. That seems pretty remarkable. The last time that I looked it up, which was yesterday, the total number of severe allergic reactions to the vaccines, all of them, is 21 cases of anaphylactic shock, and none of them were fatal. They were all stopped. The reason that it matters and the reason that it's important about this pathogen is because of the characteristic of this pathogen to transmit in the pre-symptomatic and asymptomatic phase. So the reason that companies and government agencies are imposing mandates is because you can walk into that chamber, and I believe actually your colleague, Council Member Kelly, I think, was the one who discussed how you might take a test on Friday and go to lunch on Saturday with somebody who's sick, contract the virus on Monday, still not symptomatic, receive your negative results, go to the meeting on Monday night, and create a super spreader event, maybe one of our community members dies. It's entirely possible. In fact, it's even plausible, and one might even say probable that it could happen. So you said you're worried about an allergic reaction, and I obviously don't know anything about your medical history, and I'm not asking to. I don't want to know. The main reason for concern of allergies to these vaccines is if you're, in particular, if you have an allergy for polyethylene glycol. So if that's your allergy, then I understand completely, because that's the allergy that's a concern. Some folks have said I had a negative reaction to a flu vaccine in the past. Am I going to have a negative reaction to this? And one doctor I was listening to this weekend, who was on Science Friday's podcast, she said that generally speaking, the allergic reactions to the flu vaccine are because that it's in part derived from eggs. And so if you have an egg allergy, you shouldn't take necessarily the flu shot, but that component of a vaccine is not in the COVID vaccines, so you wouldn't need to worry about that. I think the larger point is, you know, you're completely entitled to make your medical choices, but you're not entitled to endanger other people. Your liberty ends with you. So if the council is to make a decision that to enter the council chambers you have to be vaccinated, that's not discriminatory. That's not discriminatory at all. That is a policy to protect your community. Now, you can say that it's not going to hurt you, and that's fine. You're entitled to think that. If you want to roll your dice with COVID-19, go right ahead. I might remind you of the 26-year-old woman from Chicago who needed double lung transplant after her battle with COVID. She had no comorbidities. There was nothing wrong with her before she got sick. I could point out that in the cohort of people 5 to 11 who have gotten COVID, there was about 83,000 cases. About 20% of them ended up in the hospital, and of those, 30% had no underlying medical conditions. So perfectly healthy kids, 5 to 11, ended up in the hospital from COVID. 30% of 20 is what, on that case, a couple thousand kids got sick, and 94 in that cohort died. Can't say that about the vaccines. As far as we know, the vaccines at this point haven't killed really anybody. I mean, there's a doctor in Florida who may have had that polyethylene glycol allergy, and he ended up with a massive stroke as a result of some blood clots. And his case is an interesting one, but when they researched it, they did find that he was allergic to PEG, and PEG is in the vaccine. So that's what did it. And again, if that's your vaccine or your allergy, great. Yeah, that makes sense. That doesn't mean that you get to claim that you're being discriminated against, because you're not. That's not what this is about. People who are choosing not to get vaccinated are looking at the facts of the situation at 100 and where are we actually? We are at 750,000 dead Americans. 5 million dead around the world. 250 million cases. We know the risks from the virus. We know the risks from the vaccines. The vaccines, in terms of long-term risk, that's an indefeasible argument. If you say, we don't know what it's going to do to you in 2 years, and I come back after 2 years and say it didn't do anything, and you say, well, we don't know what it's going to do in 5. We don't know what it's going to do in 10. It's an argument that is something that you can't defeat. But we do know that in all of vaccine history, if there's going to be a problem from a vaccine, I'm being interrupted, hang on. Okay, sorry about that. I got interrupted at the last spot where I was recording. So, in the history of all vaccines, 99% of all severe side effects occur within 90 days. And that's been true of every vaccine ever created. So, vaccinologists, epidemiologists, they're absolutely qualified to say that at this point, with all the data that we have, human trials before the EUA was granted, with 70,000 people in them, billions of doses given out around the world. I mean, the dose count is over 7 billion. The number of people who are fully vaccinated is over 3 billion. The situation is being looked at so closely that in the case of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, they found 9 cases of blood clots in female patients. 9 cases out of, I forget how many million doses have been given. 9 cases that caused them to pause the administration of that vaccine. Research regarding, that I just read about, regarding the cohort of 5 to 11-year-olds who are now going to be eligible to receive the vaccine. Within that cohort, there were 9 deaths. Within the cohort of children aged 12 to 17, the last group that was granted, they looked at the consequences, negative results within that age group, and there were 9 cases that were listed as fatal cases of myocarditis. 9 out of several million. 6 of those have been fully investigated. This is according to a Facebook page of an epidemiologist called Your Local Epidemiologist. Great resource for looking into things about the pandemic. According to what she wrote, 6 of those cases have been fully investigated. In 3 of those 6, so 3 of the 9, the cause of death was myocarditis. And she makes a distinction. She says there's classical myocarditis, which is the result of a viral or bacteria infection, and then there's vaccine-induced myocarditis. And in the case of the 3 fatalities that were attributed to myocarditis, it was classic myocarditis, as she said. And so, in other words, of the 9 deaths that are attributed to the vaccine in that cohort of 12 to 17-year-olds, so far not one of them has been conclusively tied to the vaccine. 3 were myocarditis cases that resulted from viral infection. As far as I can tell, that's just an extreme coincidence. Somebody who got vaccinated, got an infection, got myocarditis, and died. 3 out of millions. So, if the situation is being scrutinized so closely that they're finding 9 cases of blood clots, and they're finding, 9 cases of myocarditis, and they're able to talk about the numbers of confirmed cases of anaphylactic shock across all the millions of doses that have been given at 21. They're looking at the situation very closely. The medical establishment is able to say with reasonable certainty that they understand the risks from the vaccine. And a lot of people point to the VAERS database to make an argument that the vaccine is causing harm. And I shared a great Twitter thread this morning on my Facebook page that said, it was from a woman, and she was writing an anecdotal story about how she had gone to get her 11-year-old vaccinated, and because there were none available at that location, she had to go away without getting her child vaccinated. And then later that day, her child developed a tick. Right eye was blinking a lot, and if she had been vaccinated, it would have been easy to say the vaccine caused this tick, but she hadn't been vaccinated. The point was that anytime you rely on self-reporting, you have an unverified data set. People can put in whatever they want. There's a massive anti-vaccine movement that predates the COVID vaccines, and if you ever want to talk about it, I can talk about it in detail from having been on both sides of it. I was once a part of it, and I'm a step-parent, and my stepdaughter was unvaccinated for some time, and then a bunch of things happened, and ultimately she ended up vaccinated for all the normal childhood things. She's now been vaccinated for COVID as well. She's 20 years old, and none of it was a problem. But I've been there. I've been on the anti-vaccine side. It wasn't my choice that she be not vaccinated. I was on the anti-vaccine side of things when Andrew Wakefield's paper published in the Lancet that drew a tie between autism and the MMR vaccine was published in the Lancet. I thought, that's a credible journal. That is a credible source, and it was supposedly a peer-reviewed paper. And I was right about 20 years old. Actually, I think when that was published, I think I was 18 years old. And I remember reading that. That was before you could Google things. I remember reading about that in the paper. I remember doing research about it once you kind of could use the internet for that sort of thing a couple of years later. I remember being really freaked out about vaccines. And then I remember when Andrew Wakefield admitted that he had fabricated the paper. I remember when the paper was withdrawn by the Lancet because there was no credibility to it whatsoever. And I remember thinking, I based my entire worldview about vaccines on this case, this paper that had been completely fabricated. I don't know why anybody would do that. I'm reminded of all the memes I've seen from tweets and things from doctors and nurses who have worked around the world in vaccination clinics, and they've talked about the parents who have carried their children on their backs for an entire day's walk, 30 miles to get them vaccinated, and how we have the luxury of living in these conditions of privilege where we can say things like we're not going to take the vaccine because we're skeptical. One final point, because I'm going on and on and on, but the two people that you cited, Dr. Robert Malone and Dr. Geert Vanden Bossche, first of all, according to the AMA, 96% of all American physicians have been vaccinated. So it's a large majority. Just because you find somebody that's in the 4% that's not, doesn't mean you've done your research. That's not research. That's searching for confirmation bias. Dr. Malone had a small contribution to the evolution of mRNA vaccines that was 20 years ago, and he's been roundly debunked for all the things that he said. And so I'm really surprised a person like you, who you ran on being a progressive, you're a young woman of color, and you would quote Robert Malone. He has been on every right-wing conspiracy podcast about the pandemic and vaccines that exist. He is a darling of the right-wing hysteria, panic about the pandemic in general. Not a source I would expect someone like you to cite. And then Geert Vanden Bossche, you called him a renowned virologist, I think. He's a veterinarian. That's anyway, his hypothesis that he put out there has been debunked. You can just Google Geert Vanden Bossche debunked, and many articles written by doctors exist to refute him. You know, another of the rumors about the vaccine is that it threatens fertility in men or women. And when you track this down, there was a German doctor who pointed out that in humans, the bond between the placenta and the uterus involves a spike protein, much in the same way that there's a spike protein on the coronavirus. It's a different spike protein. And if immunity to SARS-CoV-2 had any effect on that spike protein bond, we would know about it already, because natural immunity to the virus as a result of infection would have the same consequence. However, just by coincidence, in the 70,000 people that were in the original trials, several women became pregnant, several women gave birth, many pregnant women have been vaccinated since. There's absolutely no sign of any negative consequences to any of the children born from those pregnancies. Does not seem to be the case that women's fertility is affected in any way. There is some evidence that sperm count in men can be potentially short-term, can be diminished from the side effects. I mean, the side effects include fever. Fever from an infection can cause the same thing in men. So it's possible to say that it could have an impact on sperm count, but it's not going to be long-term. So we know about these things. The first people to get injected with the vaccine were people who actually elected to get infected with the virus. I remember being in Thai Orchid restaurant, listening to a podcast, waiting in line to pick up an order in May of 2020. We were trying to buy from restaurants a couple times a week to keep the ones that we like open, and I was listening to a podcast where a young, I believe 23-year-old grad student from Stanford was explaining why she was choosing to enroll herself in a vaccine trial where she was going to be intentionally infected with SARS-CoV-2 so that they could test the efficacy of the virus. That's bravery right there. They've been working on the safety record of these vaccines now for 18 months. And again, 99% of all previous severe side effects to a vaccine that have ever been recorded happened within 90 days of receiving the vaccine. So we have literally hundreds of millions of people, billions of people at this point that have had the vaccine, and they've gone into plenty of time to be monitored. So just in closing, I don't want this to come off as an attack against you, Ms. Palacios. I do think that your case is one that angers me. The case that you presented, it angers me because you were focused on yourself. You were talking about yourself and the threat to you. You never once mentioned 750,000 dead Americans. I'm struggling to respect the case of the people who are arguing against the vaccine because it seems entirely based on their own concern about themselves, ignores all of the successes of the vaccines, and seems to be relying on points that were relevant, say, in the spring and summer of 2020, before we really had a handle on what was going on. But we understand it pretty well now. And I don't think any of the arguments that you made stand up to the evidence that we have available to us now.